patience inherit the promises. The Apostle Paul told the Romans in Romans chapter 15 and verse 4 that whatever was written aforetime was written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. And in the passage that Rick read in our hearing just a few moments ago, the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 6, "Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted." The Word of God, especially the Old Testament, is filled with the stories of men and women who succeeded in their efforts to please God, and also the stories of those who failed. One day when I was in the library at Florida College, I was rummaging through the stacks looking for a book, I suppose. I don't really remember. But I ran across a book on a particular shelf, and I pulled it out. It was entitled, "Here's How by Who's Who," and that title just intrigued me. And I began to thumb through the pages, and it was a collection of short essays or articles written by famous people, people who had done well in the business world. And these essays and articles were designed to motivate, to encourage, to explain how you can be successful in life. As I think back upon that discovery, it occurs to me that the Old Testament could be entitled, "Here's How by Who's Who." And it seems to me that if we were to make a who's who list, considering all of the people that we read about in the Old Testament, Joseph and David would have to be on that who's who's list. And there's just many lessons that we can learn from these two individuals. But there's one particular lesson that I want to help you think about this morning. And so I'm calling our study "Two Godly Men and Sexual Temptation." If you're familiar with these stories, and I trust that you are, you know that one of these men succeeded in resisting sexual temptation. And the second man failed. And yet it is entirely accurate for me to describe these two men as godly men. Joseph and David were both godly men. These stories can help us, because Joseph shows us how we can resist sexual temptation. On the other hand, David shows us how we might fail. He demonstrates how we should not respond when we are faced with sexual temptation. I suppose I hardly need to say what I'm about to say, and that is that we need lessons like this, because in our society today, sexual temptation is all around us. Sexual promiscuity and sexual sin are promoted as no big deal in our television programs and in the movies. It's in the soap operas that so many of the ladies like to watch during the daytime. I'll confess, I watched some of those shows when I was growing up as well. How many husbands has Erica Kane had? You're laughing because you've watched that show, right? Well, you've heard of Erica Kane. Well, I went online and I looked it up. She's been married 12 times. Sexual promiscuity and sexual sin is portrayed in television shows that I like to watch. Kathy and I kind of like to watch Chicago Med and Chicago Fire on Wednesday evenings. But the characters in that show are sleeping with I don't know how many people. They just seem to jump in and out of bed all the time. It's even in PBS shows like Downton Abbey that took this country by storm. Advertisers have been using sex appeal for decades to sell everything from toothpaste to bulldozers. And immodesty parades our streets and our shopping malls and the grocery stores. It seems to be everywhere. You can't drive down the street without seeing women walking around wearing not hardly enough to wad a shotgun. Many years ago, the Washington Post columnist Ellen Goodman observed women are busting out of what isn't barely stretched over. And some of you will remember the black comedian named Nipsey Russell. He said, the clothes some women are wearing these days make me wonder and doubt, are they outside trying to get in or inside trying to get out? Sexual temptation is all around us. Homosexuality is being shoved down our throats in our television shows, in the movies that Hollywood is producing. It's even being portrayed on game shows like Jeopardy, even in TV commercials. Folks, we need to know how to resist sexual temptation. And Joseph shows us how to do that. You're familiar with his story, but let me quickly remind you that he was the 11th son of Jacob, the firstborn son of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. And Jacob loved him dearly and was partial to him. He showed his favoritism to Joseph by giving him a coat of many colors. Well, you can just imagine that Joseph's brothers weren't too keen on all of that. In fact, the record tells us that they hated Joseph. In the process of time, Jacob sent Joseph to go check on his brothers who were caring for their father's flock away from home. And they saw Joseph coming a great way off. And at first they plotted to kill him, and then they changed their mind. And as it turned out, there was a traveling caravan of Ishmaelites, merchants with camels loaded with their wares on the way down to Egypt. And they decided, let's sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites. And that's exactly what they did. And that brings us to our text in Genesis chapter 39, where Moses tells us, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused, and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. But it happened about this time, when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, "See, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice." And the story goes on. Potiphar's wife lies to her husband about Joseph. He believes her lie, and Joseph is thrown into prison. But brothers and sisters, Joseph shows us how we should respond to sexual temptation. My secretary messed it up again, so try not to get ahead of me. The first thing that I want to point out is that Joseph didn't rationalize his situation in an effort to justify himself. Joseph could have said all kinds of things that many people say to themselves today in an effort to justify and rationalize sexual sin. Joseph could have said, "Well, life has been so unfair to me. I've been hated by my brothers, hated to such an extent that they sold me into slavery, and all of that was unjust." Joseph might have said, "Why has God allowed this to happen to me?" And he might have said, "I'm so far away from home, away from my family and my friends, I will likely never see them again, and I'm so lonely." Reminds me of the chorus of the song that Chris Christopherson wrote entitled, "Help Me Make It Through the Night." You remember that song, I suspect. The chorus said, "I don't care what's right or wrong. I don't try to understand. Let the devil take tomorrow. Lord, tonight I need a friend. Yesterday is dead and gone, and tomorrow's out of sight. It's so sad to be alone. Help me make it through the night." Joseph could have tried to rationalize and justify a sexual affair by saying, "Well, nobody's going to know and nobody's going to get hurt." He might have said, "Well, why should I care about this since I've been unjustly enslaved, and after all, she's my master's wife. I need to do what she says. Because you see, she can make my life really easy, or she can make my life really hard. He might have thought, well, I'm a young man with all of the desires and sexual passion of youth. I may never be able to satisfy those desires any other way. Joseph could have said all kinds of things to rationalize and justify sexual sin, but he refused to do that. And if we are to avoid sexual temptation and sexual sin, we must not allow ourselves to rationalize it in our own minds. And then in the second place, the record says that he refused. When she tried to seduce Joseph, Joseph just said no. The wise man writes in Proverbs chapter 1, beginning in verse 10, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, 'Come with me,' or 'Come with us, let us lie in wait to shed blood. Let us lurk secretly for the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them alive like Sheol, and whole like those who go down to the pit. We shall find all kinds of precious possessions. We shall fill our houses with spoil. Cast in your lot among us. Let us all have one purse.' Then the wise man says, 'My son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your foot from their path.'" He's saying, just say no. Brothers and sisters, we don't have to give in to sexual temptation. And when we're tempted, we don't have to commit sexual sin. God told Cain near the beginning of time, after he had failed to offer the proper sacrifice to the Lord, Abel did, and God accepted his sacrifice. He rejected Cain's, and Cain was upset about that. And God said to Cain, verse 7, "If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you shall rule over it." God seems to portray sin as some kind of ravenous beast waiting to devour us. That's what sin desires to do. But God says you should rule over it. We don't have to yield. We don't have to say yes to sexual temptation. And please notice that Joseph refused for all of the right reasons. He refused, verse 8 shows us, because he realized that it would be a betrayal and a sin against his master. Potiphar had placed everything under Joseph's authority. Joseph was taking care of everything. Potiphar didn't even know what was going on. He left all of that to Joseph's care. And even though Joseph had been wrongly enslaved, he understood that Potiphar trusted him, and he was obligated to keep that trust. Joseph was not going to betray that kind of confidence with treachery. Potiphar had kept back nothing from Joseph except his wife, and Joseph would not covet the one thing that was forbidden. He would not defile and dishonor the marriage bed. The Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 13, verse 4, "Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous." Joseph knew that if he yielded to this temptation, it would be a misuse of his power and his position. We've already mentioned the fact that Joseph had been successful in Potiphar's household, and Potiphar had been blessed as a result. Sexual temptation is often strong for those in power, for those who have authority, like politicians, for example. And to illustrate the point, I just need to mention the names of FDR and JFK and Gary Hart and Bill Clinton and no doubt many, many others. In a Dan Rather interview on 60 Minutes that was broadcast June the 20th, 2004, Rather asked Bill Clinton about the Monica Lewinsky affair. Here was Rather's question. The central question, if I may, and I know this is difficult, the central question is why? And Clinton replied with these words, I think I did something for the worst possible reason, just because I could. I think that's just about the most morally indefensible reason that anybody could have for doing anything. When you do something just because you could. I've thought a lot about it. And there are lots of more sophisticated explanations, more complicated psychological explanations, but none of them are an excuse. Only a fool does not look to explain his mistakes. Reminds me of that well-known statement that Lord Acton made, the 19th century British politician. He said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Sexual temptation is especially strong for those in power, like politicians and business leaders and preachers. And to illustrate that point, I need do nothing more than mention the names Jim Baker and Jimmy Swaggart and Ravi Zacharias and Bill Hybels. And it's not just among preachers out there, it's among preachers in churches of Christ. But Joseph also realized that yielding to this temptation would have been a betrayal and a sin against his master's wife. And above everything else, it would have been a betrayal and a sin against God. You see, Joseph knew that there is a God and that He has a law against sexual sin, and he realized that this, above everything else, would be a sin against God. The law of Moses will later condemn adultery. It's the 7th commandment. You shall not commit adultery. And in addition to that, the law of Moses would prescribe capital punishment for adulterers. Well, Joseph lived long before the law was given to the Jews on Sinai, but folks, there was a law against adultery long before Sinai. In the time of Abraham, when Abraham urged his wife Sarah to lie about their relationship, to tell others that she was his sister and withhold the information that she was his wife, and Pharaoh took her. We read about that in Genesis 12. When Pharaoh realized what had happened, he knew that it was wrong to take another man's wife. And then later on, when the same kind of thing happened, Abimelech knew that it was wrong to take another man's wife. Well, Joseph knew that adultery was sinful in the eyes of God, and he knew that God would see that sin if he committed it. You see, Joseph understood that while he might have been able to hide his sin from his master, from his fellow servants, from everybody else, he couldn't hide that sin from God because God sees everything. The Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 4 and verse 13, "And there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must give account." And Joseph realized, as Solomon will later tell us, that God is going to bring everything into judgment. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 14, "For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil." Joseph reacted to this temptation wisely. He was not like the naive young man that we read about in the book of Proverbs, who does not recognize the wily ways of the sinful woman. He responded to this temptation promptly. He didn't flirt with it. Joseph made no provision for the flesh to satisfy the lust thereof. He didn't say to himself, "Well, maybe we can just talk. Maybe we can just hang out. Maybe we can just have a good time." No, he resisted this temptation firmly. There was no sign of wavering or indecision. His was not the answer of a man who was only half-hearted in putting away from himself the thing that he secretly desired. And then Joseph resisted this temptation repeatedly. Because Potiphar's wife came back again and again and again and propositioned Joseph. You know, it gets harder to resist temptation when it keeps rearing its ugly head again and again and again. And may I remind you that Samson yielded to Delilah because of her repeated pressure. And then Joseph avoided the temptress and her temptation all he could. The wise man tells us in Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 14 and 15, "Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of evil. Avoid it, do not travel on it, turn away from it, and pass on." Now I understand, and I know you know, that we can't avoid all sexual temptation. The only way we could do that would be to leave the world or to go up on a mountaintop all by ourselves, and we could still be tempted sexually even then. But my brethren, we can avoid a lot of sexual temptation if we only will. You remember the black comedian Flip Wilson and his character Geraldine Meter Maid Jones, and how Geraldine was talking about being with her boyfriend Killer in the booth, in the back, in the corner, and in the dark. Let me tell you, folks, that's not the place to resist sexual temptation. You ought to hear my brother imitate Geraldine Jones. Sexual temptation is something that we have to flee. It's something that we have to run away from. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 18, flee sexual immorality. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. When I lived in Johnson City, I was studying with a woman who had smoked cigarettes for years. And she was trying to quit somewhat half-heartedly, I think. I would go for a study, and she told me later she'd open up the windows. She was shocked when I said, Minnie, that's not helping. You're not hiding anything. One day I called her and we were talking, and I asked her what she was doing, and she said, well, I'm sitting on the couch looking at a cigarette laying on the coffee table. I'm trying to see how long I can resist temptation. I said, Minnie, flush that down the toilet. You got to run from temptation, especially sexual temptation. Well, let me remind you that Joseph paid a price. As I've already mentioned, Potiphar's wife lied about him, and her husband believed the lie, and he threw Joseph in prison, but Jehovah was still with Joseph. And we may pay a price. Likely will pay some kind of a price if we resist sexual temptation. We may be lonely, and we may have to put up with that loneliness. And let me tell you, folks, loneliness is everything it's cracked up to be. I know about loneliness. I've been there, done that, got the t-shirt. You may be rejected by the guy who tells you, young lady, if you love me, you'll let me. You may not be popular at school. You may be laughed at and ridiculed as a prude. You may lose that job promotion, but God's going to be with you. You see, Joseph teaches us that it really is possible for us to practice the self-control that the Bible enjoins upon us. It is possible for us to flee youthful lusts. And it's possible for us to abstain from fleshly lusts. It is possible for us to flee fornication. Well, then there's David's story. And sadly, David shows us how to yield to temptation. David shows us all the things that we shouldn't do. His life is truly a rags to riches story. He was the youngest son of his father Jesse, who took care of his father's sheep, and he was anointed by Samuel to replace King Saul. He killed the giant Goliath, and he became the darling of all the Israelites. And as a result, Saul became insanely jealous, and he hunted David all over the southern part of Palestine for years, trying to get rid of his nemesis. But finally, King Saul died in battle with the Philistines, and David became king. And as king, he was victorious over his enemies. He established Jerusalem as his capital. He reigned in triumph. But it all turned to tragedy. when he yielded to sexual temptation. You're familiar with the story that's recorded for us in 2 Samuel chapter 11. The record tells us that in the spring of the year, when kings went out to battle, David's army was besieging the city of Rabbah, and David was back home in Jerusalem. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The commentator Matthew Henry wisely observes, when we are out of the way of our duty, we are in the way of temptation. And we've all heard that old adage that says, idle hands are the devil's workshop. Isaac Watts, who composed many of the old hymns that we're familiar with, said in poetic form, in works of labor or of skill I would be busy too, for Satan finds some mischief still for idle hands to do. But you see, David yielded to sexual temptation because he allowed a glance to become a gaze. Look at verse 2. The text says, then it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. I want you to look at those two words, saw and behold. You see, I think David did more than just look. It wasn't the first look that got David into trouble. It was the second look. Because David didn't bounce his eyes. David didn't look away. He didn't seek sexual satisfaction with one of his many wives. If you've lived very long, you're going to see things you shouldn't see inadvertently, by accident. Hasn't it happened to you? It certainly happened to me. When I'm on the internet looking for a picture to put in a PowerPoint slide, I've run across some things that I have to look away from. I have to get out of there quickly. That's going to happen to us, unfortunately, but it's not the first look that gets us into trouble. It's that second look. It's when the glance becomes a gaze. And then verse 3 tells us that David pursued the situation. He sent his messengers to inquire after her. You see, unlike Joseph, David didn't run away from sexual temptation. He ran right smack dab towards it. Don't know that smack dab was appropriate in that sentence, but anyway. David ignored the red lights. I have a book in my library. It's in a box somewhere back here, entitled Running the Red Lights. And the author of that book is making the point that you've got to run a lot of red lights in order to wind up having a sexual affair. In other words, affairs aren't something that just happen. You see, when David learned that Bathsheba was the wife of another, that should have ended it. No matter how beautiful Bathsheba was, no matter how interested David was in her, when he learned that she was married to somebody else, that should have stopped it right there dead in its tracks. And then when David learned that Bathsheba's husband was Uriah, one of his mighty men, one of his elite soldiers. Uriah wasn't just an average soldier. He would have been like a Green Beret or a Ranger or something like that. That should have caused David to put the brakes on. And then when David realized that Uriah was out there with the army besieging Rabbah, that should have destroyed his infatuation. Here's my point. There were multiple points along David's journey from sexual purity to sexual sin where David could have stopped it. And folks, that will always be the case. Let me say it one more time. Affairs don't just happen. To have an affair, you've got to run a lot of red lights to get there. And of course, you know that David's sin led to other sins. When he learned that Bathsheba was expecting a child, David tried to cover it up. He sent word to Uriah to come home on furlough, thinking he'll go into his wife and the sin will be covered up. But Uriah didn't go home. And then David got him drunk, and he still didn't go into his wife. And finally, well, you remember the rest of that story, don't you? David's sin led to other sins. And that's the way it worked with sexual sins, folks. Because then you've got to be deceptive. Then you've got to lie. Not just once, but multiple times. And it's going to get hard to keep up with all the lies you've told. It can happen to godly men. David was the man after God's own heart. David was the sweet psalmist of Israel, the one who composed, 70-something psalms in the Psalter? David was a godly man. That should scare every one of us to death. David became the paradigm, the model for all of the kings that followed him. And he was that model even after his sin with Bathsheba. He paid a price. If you're familiar with his story, you know, as I've already said, that David's life turned to tragedy after his sin with Bathsheba. His son Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar, and Absalom had Amnon murdered to avenge his sister. And then Absalom had to flee for at least a couple of years before he was reunited with David. And then Absalom tried to take David's throne away, and Absalom was killed by Joab, a violation of David's express orders. And even later on, when David's an old man, his son Adonijah tries to usurp the throne that was intended for Solomon. David's life just turned to tragedy. He paid a price. A terrible price. But there is good news. When Nathan the prophet confronted David, David confessed his sin. And Nathan told him, God has forgiven you. So folks, there's still hope even after sexual sin. Sexual sin doesn't have to be the end of your service to God. After his repentance, David became useful to the Lord once again. And folks, I've known preachers and elders and preachers' wives who have committed sexual sin, repented of it, been forgiven by the Lord, and they've become useful in the Lord's service once again. So these two godly men teach us important things about dealing with sexual temptation. Joseph was a remarkable young man because he resisted the siren call of sexual temptation, and his example shows us how we can and should resist that kind of temptation today. David was a godly man who failed. But his failure teaches us what we shouldn't do, how we should not respond. And we need to remember that his failure did not define his life. I might be talking to someone in this assembly who has failed in this area. I have no idea. But if by chance that is the case and you haven't done what David did, let me assure you that God is looking and longing and waiting to forgive you. He's promised that He will if you come to Him seeking His forgiveness on His terms. And you can be useful to the Lord again. If that happened in your life years ago and you've been forgiven by the Lord, it was not my intent to add any iota of pain to you. But you see, I've got to talk about these things from time to time to help others. And so, as is our custom, we extend the invitation of our Lord. And if your life is not right with Him, we urge you to get right with Him. And we would be honored to help you do that in any way that we can. You can respond to the gospel right now.